The Dyatlov Pass Incident. It was a cold and yet normal day on January 27, 1959, when a group of 9 experienced hikers and climbers set off on a skiing expedition across the northern Ural Mountains in Sovietsk Oblast. The group had been formed from students of the Ural Polytechnical Institute, a school for various engineering programs designed to help boost the Soviet Union's rapidly expanding industrial movements. The students would be undergoing a 190-mile or 300-kilometer journey across the vast stretches of the Urals. This route was taken during the winter months of February and was rated as a Category 3 at the time, which was the most difficult time to cross. The expedition would end in mystery and disaster, with all 9 hikers becoming casualties of something truly strange. The time had finally come. The group had all of its travel plans signed off by the local authorities. The group had traveled by train to Ivdel and then took a truck to the town of Vizhai. Upon arriving to the furthest inhabited settlement of the north, they purchased supplies of bread and other items for the expedition ahead. The morning had come, and they began their trek towards Otorten, when one of the students, Yuri, suffered injuries during the hike early on and had to turn back alone. Lucky for him, perhaps. The remaining hikers continued the trek onward. Thanks to diaries and cameras that had been found at the last campsite, they made it possible to track the group's movements up until the incident. On January 31st, the group arrived at the edge of a highland area and began preparing for climbing. They cached their extra supplies and prepared themselves for crossing the pass. They had planned to quickly cross the pass and set up a new camp on the other side. The expedition set out early that morning to cross the pass. The weather quickly began to worsen according to official reports and investigators. Snowstorms had made visibility increasingly difficult, and this had made the group lose their direction and head westward towards Kalat. Kalat was a mountain known by locals and the natives of the land as Dead Mountain. By the time the group had realized their mistake, the group quickly decided to set up camp there on Dead Mountain instead of trek 1.5 kilometers or 1 mile downhill into a tree line, which would have offered tree cover and protection. Yuri, the group leader, feared that having gone down in altitude it would increase the time and set them off. The expedition had been keeping track in a journal and making entries daily, and thanks to that information, one of the last updates that they put in the journal, on particular the day they were crossing the pass, they made the following notes in the journal. Day temperature, 13 Celsius, or Fahrenheit, 8.6 degrees. Night temperature, negative 26 Celsius, or 14 degrees below Fahrenheit. The wind is strong, southwest. Snow begins to fall, heavy clouds, drop in temperature. The temperature is normal for the northern Urals. They then tell us about a story of the local natives. This is a story about the forests, the Mansi sign tell, about animals that they saw, resting stops, and other things. It is particularly interesting to solve its meaning for the hikers as well as historians. The deer trail turns into a trodden path and then ends. To go without a trail is very hard. Snow is 120 centimeters deep, or 4 feet deep. The forest gradually thins and the trees get smaller. You can feel the altitude. Lots of dwarf birches and pines. It is impossible to walk on the river right now. It is not completely frozen. There is ice and water under the snow. We have to go back on the bank of the river. The day is over and we have to find a place for camp. That's the stop for the night. Strong west wind. It blows the snows off the cedar and pine trees, creating the impression of snowfall. As usual, we quickly start a fire and pitch the tent on some fir branches. We are warmed by the fire and go to sleep. This is one of the last journal entries that they put in their log. It had been agreed beforehand that Dyatlov would send a telegram to their sports club as soon as the group returned to Vizhai. It was expected that this would happen no later than February 12th, but Dyatlov had told Yudin that he had expected it to be longer. And so when the date passed and no message had been received, there was no immediate reaction. Delays of a few days were common in such expeditions. Only after the relatives of the travelers demanded a rescue operation did the head of the institute send the first rescue groups consisting of volunteer students and teachers. On February 20th, later, the army and police force would become involved, with planes and helicopters being ordered to join the rescue operation. It would not be until February 26th that the searchers would find the abandoned camp and badly damaged tent on Dead Mountain. Mihal Sarvarin, a student who had found the tent, said, "The tent was torn in half and covered with snow. It was empty and all the group's belongings and shoes had been left behind. Investigators said that the tent had been cut open from the inside and that the skiers had fled in socks or barefoot. A chain of 8 or 9 footsteps could be seen in the snow, left by several people who were wearing socks, a single shoe, or even barefoot, could be followed and led down towards the edge of the nearby woods, on the opposite end of the pass. After about 500 meters, they would be covered by snow." The conclusion left from the tent formed by the investigators and searchers came up with the following. The hikers quickly left the tent without outer clothes, gloves, and shoes. One quote really spells out the general thoughts amongst the searchers at the time. Quote, "Only exceptional serious threat might have motivated a group of 9 young, physically fit people to leave their shelter in the winter evening and flee to a completely inhabited forest. Was it a retreat down the hill, or immediate and imminent death at the camp?" What also added to the confusion of the investigators and searchers at the time was the fact that the group even had been semi-armed. Hikers had left behind 3 axes and 3 finished knives in the tent. This left us speculating that the threat was beyond self-defense with these items. Even more strange was that the retreat was not towards their cache that had supplies for surviving, including food, additional clothing, and other items, but rather they fled into an unknown forest off their planned path and even evacuation paths. This was total chaos. On February 27, 1959, the search would continue. The investigators and searchers would follow the tracks in the snow for approximately 400 meters from the tent down to the forest edge. There at the forest edge, the footprints just stopped, but the investigators kept going forward until they came across a lone cedar tree that was of particular interest. At the base of the cedar tree, they found the remains of a campfire, and approximately 3 meters away from the campfire, they found the bodies of Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krishenko. Doroshenko had pulmonary edema and pulmonary contusions as a result of blunt force trauma. Koroshenko had bitten off a piece of his own knuckle to stay awake or stifle a cry and had a 3rd-degree burn that is very unusual for somebody that is freezing to death. To this point of the 3 bodies found and autopsied, Igor Dyatlov showed the least amount of damage during his autopsy. Most interesting, his autopsy report revealed that on his right hand he had red and brown bruises. This was an indication of a hand-to-hand fight. To get a better idea of the injuries, just make a fist. This is the part of the hand which you use to hit somebody. So not only was Igor found with his fist ready to fight, facing up, he also had damage to his hands. Zenita Kolmogorova would be found 630 meters away from the cedar tree, face down, heading towards the tent. Of her autopsy result, nothing was particularly interesting. She was wearing the most clothes of all those bodies found that day. On March 5th, they would find the body of Rustam Slobon. He had been found face down 480 meters away from the cedar, heading towards the tent as well. His autopsy was performed on March 8th. Of the autopsy results, the most interesting finds are the following. He had damage to his right hand, such that as in a fight, as well as a fracture of the frontal face bone. Searching efforts would continue on from that point for an additional 2 months and went on without a trace for the remaining 4 hikers. On May 9th, the Dyatlov Pass den was found. It is one of the key issues in the whole Dyatlov Pass incident. On one hand, it clearly shows that the members of the party were sane enough to do anything in their power to survive. On the other hand, it is still unclear why their attempts didn't work. Another question is, where did the knife that cut the branches go? The den was made by the surviving 4 members of the Dyatlov group approximately 70 meters away from the cedar in a ravine that was hidden from the cold winds. It was probably an idea of Zoltarov. It was a common way to survive the winters at the front, and given the circumstances, it offered the best chance of survival for those who remain behind, waiting in hope that their friends will make it to the top of the mountain. It further undermines the theory of undressing and paradox. The group clearly realized the threats and did everything they could to preserve themselves. Cedar branches were brought here and laid out to minimize contact of human bodies and the cold snow underneath. Furthermore, Ludmila Dubiana had a sweater and pants of Kurashenko. Both, as it turned out, had radiation present on them. However, the strangeness of the case was not yet resolved. In fact, it became even more weird. All but 3 members had significant damage to their bones. They were crushed with an immense force. Doctors compared the extent of the damage to being hit by a car. A second thing that was striking about the den is that the bodies were actually found a few feet from their improvised shelter in a deep part of the ravine, on an area of only 4 square meters. Some of the clothes that had been taken from the bodies left underneath the cedar tree were placed on cedar tree branches, but apparently they had not even been used. Near the den, the first body found would be that of Ludmila Dubiana. Her body was found pressed up against a rock on her knees. Her face and chest were pressed into the rock. Her autopsy report showed something truly dark and mysterious. Not only had her jacket tested positive for radioactive materials, but as well she was missing her tongue, soft tissue around her eyes, eyebrows, her nose bridge, and cheekbone had all been partially exposed. Her teeth and her upper jaw is exposed, and her tongue is missing according to the autopsy report. Her ribs 2, 3, 4, and 5 are broken on the right side, and 2 fracture lines are visible. Ribs 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7 on the opposite side were fractured, and there was a massive hemorrhage in the heart. Further autopsy details show that her stomach was filled with essentially her own blood, indicating that her tongue had been removed while she was still alive. The autopsy results on Semen Zolotarov and Alexander Kolotov would also prove disturbing information. Zolotarov was missing his eyeballs, soft tissue around his eyebrows, and bone was exposed on the face. He also had a flailed chest, broken ribs 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the right side, and 2 fracture lines. Alexander Kolotov's autopsy report showed that he had been missing soft tissue around his eyes. His eyebrows are gone, and skull bones are exposed at that area. The nose has been broken, as well as his neck had been snapped right below the ear line. The final autopsy of Nikolai Theobeks Briganoli had discovered that his skull had a severe fracture, as well as damage on his right arm. Autopsy results indicate that his damage couldn't have been occurred from simply falling. He had to have been thrown and severely hit his head. It is expected that he could have only survived 2 to 3 hours after sustaining this head trauma, and he would likely have been unconscious and had to lay there. Both Nikolai and Zoltarov had been outside the tent at the time of the mysterious threat had struck the camp. Both of them had left the tent earlier in the evening to go relieve themselves and explore around, and were fully dressed for the winter. They had jackets, double layers, boots, and everything. So now that we have the basic events outlined from the Dyatlov Pass incident, we are left asking ourselves why. What happened that cold February night? Well, not only did we have detailed information from the expedition in the form of diaries and photographs, but we also had detailed personal accounts from the investigators as well as from searchers. This case has fascinated people for nearly 60 years for good reason, because there's just no simple answer. There's too many strange things to just write it off as hypothermia death. Even the original investigation said that they died from unusual circumstances. It's very strange. So let's go over what we know, and I'll kind of talk about what I think. Based on the evidence that I have seen, read, and detail, I think that the group ran into something truly unusual that night, something so unknown to them and scary, they were left with no choice. From the reports and the diaries, we know that the group had settled in on Dead Mountain at, roughly 5. They got their tent set up, and they began to eat dinner around 6 to 7. Around this time, they reported that the tent was very warm and comfortable. Instead of going down the mountain to set up camp in the forest, they chose to stay where they were on Dead Mountain, on the slope, because they didn't want to lose altitude and lose any time. That was Dyatlov's choice. We know that 2 members of the expedition had left that tent to go and relieve themselves. They were fully clothed, able. They went off and did something somewhere. Around 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, this is when something spooked them to the point where they refused to use the front entrance of the tent, and rather they cut open multiple holes and frantically fled into the night, taking nothing with them. Barefooted, socks, 1 shoe, half clothed. We know that they had axes and knives in the tent, so they had the ability to defend themselves. But they chose not to. They left that all behind, and they frantically fled into the night, completely ignoring evacuation plans, basic needs for survival in this type of climate. So, they frantically fled into the middle of the night, down into an unexplored portion of the forest to them. They hadn't been in there yet. At that point, the 2 members who had left the tent earlier must have heard the frantic screams and cries from the group, and at some point, something spooked them to the point where they decided to climb the cedar tree. They were on the cedar tree. They tried climbing up to 4 meters high into the cedar tree, essentially, breaking off branches as they went. And as it was described, their hands were essentially a bloody pulp. They were trying to get away from something, hide from something. Who knows what they were attempting to do, but they were frantically trying to get up that tree. These were the 2 who had left the tent earlier in the day. At some point in time, the 2 attempted to make a campfire at the bottom when they realized either it was safe to come down from the tree or they just didn't have a choice. They also cut branches nearby in order to build a blind. That was one of the details in the report that was very strange to me. They attempted to stack fir branches in a way that they could hide themselves in their campfire from the direction of the tent. What were they attempting to hide from? What were they attempting to get away from and climb up that tree? We don't know. Eventually these 2 would freeze to death. 3 of the other hikers that had fled out of the tent would eventually find them, and they would take their clothing off their bodies and wear it themselves. Keep in mind that they had left that tent in a hurry and had nothing on them. At some point in time, they decided to return to the tent. This would be Dyatlov and the other 2. Now, at different points between the cedar tree and the tent, these 3 members would also perish. Now, this is different intervals, of course. We had one who passed away 150 meters from the tent. We had another one who passed away 200 meters from the tent. And then another one that was like 420 meters away from the tent. Clearly, they were making their way back to the tent, and one by one, they died. It's truly strange. And you can go back to the autopsy reports and see individually which one of those had strange wounds. To me, Igor Dyatlov, the main leader of the expedition, was the strangest. He was found deceased, face up, with his fists in the air. He had injuries on his right hand. Self-defense wounds. If you come across something that terrifies you, what is the first thing you're going to do? I know myself, I'm going to try to defend myself. You don't just sit there and take it. The other 2, unfortunately, passed away face down. And clearly, something strange happened. All of them showed signs of hypothermia. That is known. I don't personally believe in the theory that is what killed them in the end. It may have been a cause of death, but what caused them to flee the tent, in my opinion, would be the thing that caused their death. Now, the other 4 remaining members wouldn't be found for 2 months. after this, after the initial investigators and searchers found, the first 5. They would later be found further away from the cedar tree. So they had fled past the cedar tree far back. They had built the shelter. They had time to get a den built. They had branches laid down to help insulate them from the snow so they wouldn't freeze to death. Yet, all 4 would die relatively close to the den. None of them would die inside the den. Now, this is where it gets truly strange and unexplainable. They made no attempt to go back to the tent whatsoever. Instead, they stayed in the ravine down in that forest. They had a cache of supplies all of them knew about and could have gone to for extra clothes, food, axes, etc. None of them made an attempt to go there. They stayed where they were. Okay, if you're in a survival situation because, say, an avalanche happened or you're freezing to death, why would you stay in one place instead of going to where you know you can survive? They could go back to the tent and get their supplies. They could go to their cache and get supplies. They chose not to do any of that. Now keep in mind, this area is an extremely flat-ish area. It's a slope, but you can see everything around you. They had choices, but they didn't make them because of some circumstance. The 4 that died in the ravine were missing tongue, missing eyes, and even in the autopsy report it showed that I believe it was Dubiana, she was missing her tongue, and it had to have been removed while she was still alive. She had swallowed an enormous amount of her own blood. Her heart was still pumping when that tongue was removed. That evidence can't be disputed because that is from the autopsy report itself. Now, the 2 that were found together, and forgive me, I can't remember all their names off the top of my head. He was covering his friend and protecting him. They all had severe injuries. What was he protecting his friend? He was covering his friend with his body, and they both died there. The clothing had radiation on it. How do you explain that? I can't. The 4th member and the last member to have perished, Diabex, he had some very strange injuries as well. He had some damage to his face as if he was hit, as well as the head injury he had sustained couldn't have occurred from just falling and hitting his head on a rock. Something had to have hit him with the force that broke him apart. With all these details, all this evidence, we're left asking ourselves what? Now, I can't go into my theories on this video. It's already long enough. But I will say this. Something unknown, something truly disturbing, made them have one choice that night: to flee. They knew that they couldn't defend themselves with weapons, and that they had no choice to get out of that tent and run for their lives, or they were going to or die. We know that whatever was outside that tent that night, it didn't matter that they were in a group of 7 at that time. They made the choice to frantically leave that tent with nothing. And as a result, unfortunately, they all perished as well. We don't know what would have happened if they all stayed in the tent, but what we do know is essentially they split up into 3 different groups, and all 3 groups were perished. One thing I learned from my time in the military is you stay together as a unit. Even in normal wildlife encounters, if you came across a wild bear, for example, you huddle together and you make a bigger animal. You make a lot more noise. These individuals were so spooked that they completely let go of all thoughts of survival, basic instinct, everything. They just fled. Now, the Dyatlov Pass incident is truly one of the most amazing, spooky, and just unknown things that we have out there. There are hundreds of theories on what happened that night, and I plan on making a second video where I go into that. I'm going to go into details of the primary theories, and I'm telling you guys, there's everything from Yetis, UFOs, to the Soviet KGB, to an avalanche. There is tons, and I can't wait to go into it in that video. This one's getting a little too long. I already had an audio issue where, as you can see, I had to shut off the webcam. So I'm re-recording this at a later date. This was my first attempt at a YouTube video on this genre. I hope you have enjoyed it, and if you could do me a huge favor, if you've enjoyed this, if you can like it, subscribe. I'm going to be making tons of videos on this subject matter. I'm probably not going to go as in detail because this one was pretty in-depth. But if you did enjoy this type of video, let me know in the comments below. Please help support this. I would love to make this something that I could do on a weekly basis. I plan on putting out 2 to 3 videos at some point. Again, thank you guys for your support. I hope you enjoyed. Stay tuned for that second video, and don't forget to comment below what you think may have happened to the group. Let me know how I did. Hope you all have a great holiday. You take care. This is Zach with the Spook Report.